The alarm did not wail. It clicked. One clean click, then silence. Then Captain Nora Voss, standing over my station with her hand already on the comm switch before I had finished blinking myself awake. Ellis. Contacts. 4 of them. Big. I count things when I am scared. It is a habit from a childhood I do not talk about. 4 ships. 4 very large ships, arranged in a pattern too neat to be anything but deliberate, sitting between the Marrow and the star system we had just spent 11 years, crossing a gap of dead space to reach. We were the first human vessel to leave our galaxy and arrive in another one. Nobody warns you how loud silence gets when you are the only ship for 2 million light-years and then, without warning, you are not. Options, Voss said. None good, I said. They outmass us 4-1. Sensors read them as escort class, not warships. Could be ceremonial. Could be a firing squad wearing a nice hat. That was Nora Voss. 22 years in the fleet. Half of them fought against things that do not have names anymore because nobody survived long enough to name them. She did not flinch. She had run out of flinch somewhere around year 15. The 4 ships did not fire. They opened a channel instead, and a voice came through that sounded like wind chimes arguing with a cello, translated a half-second later into passable English by our system. Unknown vessel, you have entered compact monitored space. Please identify your origin and intention. I looked at Voss. Voss looked at the ships on the screen, then at me, then said the thing that would end up printed on recruitment posters back home within the decade. Tell them we're lost, and we're friendly, and we would very much like to not die today. I did not say it that way. I said it professionally, the way training taught me, but that was the sentiment, and somehow the Compact's translation software caught the shape of it anyway, because the response that came back had a warmth in it I was not expecting. Welcome, travelers. You are a long way from anywhere. Please hold position. An envoy vessel is being dispatched to greet you properly. Properly. I liked that word. I did not trust it, but I liked it. The envoy ship arrived 4 hours later, small and elegant, built from a metal that caught starlight, and threw it back in colors that should not exist. A being stepped off it and onto our boarding ramp wearing something between a robe and an exoskeleton. 4 eyes arranged in a diamond on a face that was trying very hard, in its own alien way, to look friendly. I am Senet Oro, cultural liaison of the Compact, it said, and its voice in person was gentler than through the comm, softer around the edges. On behalf of 1,043 member species, I welcome you to civilization. Nora Voss stepped forward and shook the offered limb, which had 3 fingers and a thumb positioned wrong for a handshake, but managed one anyway. Captain Nora Voss. UNS Marrow. This is Ellis Cole, my communications officer. Senet Oro turned those 4 eyes on me, and something in its posture read, even across species, as delight. A pleasure. You are the first new species to make contact in 300 years. We had begun to think we had found everyone worth finding. A pause. A tilt of the head that felt almost shy. What does your species want? Territory? Trade? Alliance? I opened my mouth to give the official answer. The one drafted by a committee back on Earth that took 4 months and 11 revisions. What came out instead was smaller than that, and truer than that, and I did not plan it. We just want to go home. We're just bad at it. Senet Oro laughed, a sound like glass wind chimes finally agreeing on something, and the tension in the room eased half a degree. It reached out again, warmly this time, and rested one 3-fingered hand on my shoulder, the way you would touch an old friend. My hand was on my sidearm, before my brain caught up with what my hand was doing. Nobody saw it but me. My fingers found the grip, curled, held. A half second. Maybe less. Then I made myself let go. Made myself smile. Made myself say something forgettable about the long trip and low sleep and please excuse me. And the moment passed the way moments do when everyone in the room agrees not to look at them. Senet Oro did not notice, or was polite enough not to say. I noticed. I noticed for the rest of that day, and the day after, and I am noticing it again right now, telling you this, because it turned out to be the first small stone in an avalanche that the whole Compact would spend the next year trying to understand, and never quite manage. They did not know yet what kind of species had just knocked on their door. We did not entirely know either. That was the frightening part. The tour of the outer system took 3 days. Senate Oro walked us through structures that made our arcology rings look like sand castles, showed us gardens grown on the hulls of ships that had not fought a war in 11,000 years, introduced us to species with skin like glass, and species with no skin at all, and species that communicated in colors we had to have translated by machine, because our eyes could not see half the spectrum they spoke in. Everyone was kind, everyone was curious, everyone asked, in one form or another, the same question Senate Oro had asked at the very start. What do you want? And every time, Voss gave the polished answer, and every time I stood behind her, and thought about the half-second my hand had spent on my weapon, and wondered how many other half-seconds were sitting quietly inside every person on our crew, waiting for an excuse. On the third night, ship time, Voss called me to her quarters. She did not offer me a seat. She never did. She poured 2 glasses of something amber that had traveled 11 years in a sealed compartment for exactly this kind of conversation, and pushed one across the table. You reached for your weapon, she said. Not a question. You saw that. I see everything on this ship. It's my job to see everything on this ship. She drank. You're not in trouble, Ellis. I did the same thing the first time a compact officer touched my arm during the handshake protocol. Every single person on this crew has done it at least once since we got here. I've been keeping count. I thought about that. 84 crew. 84 sets of reflexes built by a homeworld that had spent 3 centuries teaching its children that unexpected touch from a stranger meant something was about to go very wrong. They don't know what we are yet, Voss said, quiet now, looking at the amber in her glass instead of at me. They think we're explorers, pioneers, the next friendly species to join their very long, very peaceful list. We are explorers. We're also the only species on that list that had to learn to be friendly on purpose. Everyone else got here easy. We didn't. She looked up. I need you to understand something, and I need you to carry it, because you're going to be the voice of this ship every time we talk to them. We are not dangerous because we want to be. We are dangerous because we had no other way to still be here. There's a difference. But from the outside, from where they're standing, that difference might not show. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about Senate Oro's hand on my shoulder, warm and easy and unafraid, and about the 11 years of black nothing between galaxies that had turned every one of us into something that flinched first and asked questions second. Somewhere out past the observation window, the compact's home galaxy turned slowly on its axis, 1,000 species living in a piece so old it had forgotten it needed defending. They had no idea what they had just invited in for tea. 4 days later, everything changed. And it changed because of a training exercise that nobody meant as anything more than a polite show of manners. I did not know that yet. Nobody on the Marrow knew that yet. All we knew, at 0600 ship time, was that our sensors had just picked up an enormous fleet moving into formation, 3 systems away, and that nobody had told us it was coming. 14 minutes. That is how long it took for a friendly gesture to become a funeral. I was at my station when the sensors lit up, 3 systems away. More ships than I had ever seen gathered in one place. Rows of them, columns of them, a wall of hulls arranged with the kind of precision that only means one of 2 things, and neither of those things is small talk. Captain! My voice came out steadier than I felt. Fleet formation, bearing 270. I count over 400 vessels. Voss was on the bridge in under a minute, hair still damp, uniform half-fastened. She did not ask if I was sure. She looked at the screen, and she was sure enough for both of us. Hail them. I hailed them. Nothing came back. Not silence exactly. There was a signal, a low hum of something trying to connect, but no words rode on top of it. Just a carrier wave, and 400 ships arranging themselves into a shape that looked, from where we sat, exactly like the leading edge of an offensive line. We did not know it yet, but on the other end of that carrier wave, a compact fleet commander named Priya Nandan was watching her own screens and smiling, because to her, this formation meant something entirely different. It was a courtesy, a demonstration. The compact way of saying, quietly and without threat, we are many, we are strong, please respect that, and also please be humble, the way you show a new neighbor's dog the fence line before you ever raise your voice. She had run this exact drill for 43 other first contact species. Every one of them had understood it as intended. A show, not a threat. A greeting with muscle behind it, nothing more. She had never met a species that grew up the way we did. "They're not answering," I said. "Formation still tightening. Ellis, talk to me. What does this read as?" I did not have a good answer. Every training scenario I had ever run said the same thing. Silent fleet, closing formation, no response to hail. 3 systems from your position and closing. That is not a greeting. That is a countdown. "Captain, if this were Earth doctrine, this is the last window before a strike." Voss did not hesitate. That was the thing about her. 11 years of dead space between galaxies teaches a captain that hesitation is a luxury for species that have never had to bury a homeworld. She had buried 2 continents in the 3rd expansion war. She was not going to bury a starship on the strength of hoping a silent fleet meant well. "Bring weapons online. Full spread. Do not fire until I say so, but I want everything hot in case I have to say so fast." 6 minutes. That is how long the 2 fleets sat there. One broadcasting nothing but formation, the other broadcasting nothing but readiness. Each one utterly certain of what the other meant, and both of them wrong. On Priya Nandan's side, she was reporting back to her own command that the newcomer vessel was showing unusual thermal signatures, unusual power draws, and she used the word interesting 3 times in that report, because to her, a species arming itself in response to a courtesy formation was a fascinating cultural data point, not a threat. The compact had not seen a real weapon discharged in anger in 11,000 years. She did not have the instinct to be afraid. Because fear like that had died out of her people so long ago, it had become a myth in old texts, the kind of story you tell children about ancestors who once needed something called an army. On our side, every second of silence confirmed what training had taught us to expect. We had learned, at terrible cost, that the gap between silence and disaster is measured in minutes, not days. Sol System had not survived 3 near extinctions by giving anyone 6 minutes of good faith. At the 7-minute mark, one of the compact vessels shifted position, a small adjustment, a routine correction any pilot would recognize as nothing at all. Voss read it as the first ship breaking formation to open a firing lane. "Fire!" I have relived that word more times than I can count. 1 syllable, half a second of breath behind it. It carried the weight of 11 years of dead space and 3 centuries of learning the hard way that mercy is something you offer after you are certain you will survive to regret withholding it. The Marrow's weapons were things the compact had never catalogued, because nobody in their long, gentle history had ever needed to build them. We did not fire once. We fired a pattern, layered and overlapping, designed by engineers who had spent 100 years making sure that if humanity ever had to fight again, it would only have to do it once. 41. Compact ships were destroyed or disabled in the first 90 seconds, the rest scattered, and this is the part that still sits wrong in my chest when I tell it. They scattered not because they were beaten, they scattered because they still, even then, did not understand what had happened to them. Priya Nandan's own vessel took damage in the second wave. I learned later that her last transmission before she went dark was not a distress call. It was a question, repeated 3 times on an open channel to no one in particular. Why? 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 By the time our system untangled the truth, cross-referencing formations and intent logs the compact rushed to release once the shooting stopped. The drill had never been anything but a drill. A show of strength meant to be admired, not answered. A gesture from a civilization so far removed from the idea of ambush that it had not occurred to a single officer in that fleet to broadcast, in words, "We mean you no harm," because in 11,000 years, nobody had ever needed to say it out loud. Voss stood on the bridge afterward with the tactical display still glowing red with wreckage, and she did not say anything for a long time. I did not either. I looked down at my console instead, at a coffee stain that had spread from my mug during the fighting, a small brown continent creeping toward the edge of my keyboard, and I thought, with a focus that embarrasses me now, that I really should have used the lid. I did not think about the 41 ships, not then. I thought about the coffee stain, and how it had gotten into the seam between 2 keys, and how I was probably going to have to pull the whole panel to clean it properly. That is what shock does. It finds something small enough to hold, because the real thing is too large to pick up all at once. Ellis. Voss's voice, quiet. Open a channel. All frequencies. I need to talk to whoever is left out there. I opened it. My hands were steady. I do not know how, but they were. What came back 20 minutes later was not a threat and not a demand for surrender. It was Senate Oro's voice, cracked in a way I had not heard from it before, asking a single question that the whole compact would spend the next several months trying to answer for themselves. What are you? We did not have a good answer for that either. Not yet. The inquiry began 3 days after the drill, and it did not look like the tribunals I had studied in officer training, the kind with raised voices and pointed fingers, and someone eventually marched off in restraints. It looked more like a very large, very quiet library, filled with representatives from species I could not have named a week earlier, all of them sitting in careful concentric rings around a central platform where Voss and I were asked to stand and speak. Senate Oro sat in the second ring. It did not look at me the way it had on the boarding ramp, warm and curious. It looked at me now the way you look at a locked door you used to walk through freely, wondering what changed on the other side. The compact counselor presiding, a being named Torvald Nieri, who represented no single species but the inquiry body itself, opened the session with a voice pitched low enough that the whole chamber leaned in to hear it. "We are not here to assign blame," Torvald said. 41 crews are gone, and we grieve that loss regardless of cause. We are here to understand. Captain Voss, Communications Officer Cole, we would like to understand what led to this response. Voss gave her account first, clean and factual, the story of thermal readings and closing formations, and 6 minutes of silence that felt, to a crew raised the way ours was, like the loudest silence in the galaxy. Then it was my turn, and this is where the questions stopped being about the drill and started being about us. "Officer Cole," Torvald said, "your species reacted to a demonstration of strength as though it were an imminent attack. In 11,000 years, we have performed similar demonstrations for 43 other newly contacted civilizations. None of them responded as yours did. Can you help us understand why?" I looked at Senate Oro before I answered. I do not know why. Maybe because it was the first alien face that had ever been kind to me, and some part of me wanted permission before I said the next part out loud. "Because where we come from," I said. "Silence before an attack is not an unusual thing. It's the normal thing. It's what you learn to expect, because it's what happened, more than once, before we learned better." "Before you learned better," Torvald repeated, careful with the phrase, turning it over like it might mean something different from what it seemed to. "Tell us what better looked like, for your people." I did not answer that right away. Some things you do not hand over easily, even to a room full of beings trying, in their own alien and genuine way, to understand you, rather than condemn you. "It looked like surviving," I said finally. "That's what better looked like. We got very good at surviving. We are still learning how to be anything else." Nobody in that chamber said anything for a long moment. Senate Oro's 4 eyes were fixed on me, and I could not read the expression on a face built so differently from mine, but something in the stillness of it felt, for the first time since the drill, less like fear and more like grief. The session recessed without a verdict, without an accusation, without anything resembling closure. Torvald simply thanked us both, said the inquiry would continue the following day, and dismissed the chamber into a silence so total I could hear my own boots on the floor the entire walk back to the shuttle. Voss did not speak until we were airborne, the inquiry building shrinking behind us into a jeweled dot against the dark. "They're not looking for someone to punish," she said. "They're looking for someone to explain. Do you understand the difference?" "I understand it," I said. "I'm not sure I can give them what they're asking for. You're going to have to try. Tomorrow, they're not going to ask about the drill anymore." Voss turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had known her, something in her expression looked almost like worry, not for the mission, but for me specifically. "Tomorrow, they're going to ask about home." I did not sleep that night either. I sat in my quarters with the lights off and thought about my father's ledger, the one he kept during the rationing, 300 names crossed out in a handwriting that got shakier every month, and I thought about how I was going to explain that to a room full of beings who had never once, in 11,000 years, had to choose who got to eat. I did not have an answer by morning. I went to the inquiry anyway, because that is what you do when the alternative is worse. The second session of the inquiry did not begin with a question. It began with a record, projected in the center of the chamber, glowing soft blue against the dark, and I recognized it before Torvald Nieri said a single word, because it was a copy of a document that should never have left Earth. My father's ledger. We were given access to your ship's historical archive as a gesture of transparency, Torvald said, and there was something careful in the way it said the word transparency, like it already suspected the gesture had cost more than it intended. We did not expect to find records like this one. Officer Cole, would you tell us what we are looking at? I stared at the pages. 311 names, most of them crossed through, my father's handwriting growing thinner and shakier as the months passed, the ink running out twice and being replaced with something darker and cruder that I never asked him about because by then I already understood. That's a ration ledger, I said. From the Third Expansion War. My father kept it for the block we lived on. 311 households. He crossed a name off every time someone in that household died or was reassigned to a colony that wasn't expected to come back. How many names remained uncrossed by the end? Torvald asked, and I understood then that it already knew the answer and was asking anyway because the room needed to hear it, not because the counselor needed to. 40, I said. 40 out of 311. The chamber did not gasp. Nobody in the compact had a reaction built for numbers like that, because nobody in the compact had needed one in 11,000 years. What I heard instead was something more unsettling than a gasp. I heard silence deepen, the particular silence of a room full of people trying to imagine something their own history had no shape for. Senate Oro spoke for the first time that session, its voice smaller than I had heard it before. This was one war. This was one street, I said. During one of 3 wars my species fought inside a single century. We call the century before that one the Third Expansion, because we ran out of new numbers to give the wars. We started running out of new places to put people even faster. Sol system is not large. It never was. When you have a war on a system that small, there is nowhere for the losing side to retreat to. You either win, or you become a name someone crosses off a ledger. Torvald let that sit before continuing, and when it spoke again, its tone had shifted from inquiry into something closer to careful sorrow. We had understood from your official records that humanity endured hardship in its past. We did not understand the scale, or the recency. A pause. Officer Cole, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know there is no correct answer I am hoping to hear. When you fired on our fleet, was it because you believed you were about to lose your ship? No, I said. It's because we've learned that believing you might lose your ship, even a little, even for 6 minutes, is the last mistake some of us ever get to make. We don't wait to find out if we're right anymore. We stopped being able to afford that a long time ago. A counselor 2 rings back, a species I did not have a name for yet, translucent and slow-moving, asked the question that I think every being in that chamber was actually holding underneath their politeness. Is this the nature of your entire species? Do all humans carry what you are describing? I thought about Voss, standing quietly beside me, who had buried 2 continents. I thought about 84 crew members who had all, at some point during our tour of the compact, reached for a weapon that was not there. I thought about my own hand on my sidearm, 4 days ago now, in response to nothing more dangerous than a friendly touch on the shoulder. Not all of us carry it the same way, I said, but I don't think there's a human alive who doesn't carry some version of it. It's not something we're proud of. It's not something we chose. It's just what happens to a species that keeps almost running out of itself. A long silence followed, longer than any that session had produced. Torvald Nieri finally leaned forward, and its next words were not delivered as counselor to witness. They were delivered, as close as I could tell from a being that alien, as something almost like an apology. On behalf of the compact, I want to say this plainly. We approached your arrival the way we have approached every arrival, for 11,000 years, as an occasion for welcome, curiosity, and celebration. We did not consider that a species could arrive here, already at war with a history it never fully escaped. That is a failure of our understanding, not a failure of your conduct. 41 crews are still gone, and that grief does not disappear because we now understand the cause. But I want this inquiry to reflect, clearly and for the record, that we no longer view this tragedy as an act of aggression. We view it as the visible edge of a wound your species has been carrying for longer than some of our civilizations have existed. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly at that, the first real relief I had felt since the drill. And then Senate Oro, quiet until now, said the thing that undid it again just as quickly. "It is a tragedy," it said, looking directly at me, 4 eyes soft with something that in a human face would have been tears. "What your people have lived through, it is a tragedy." "No," I said, and I did not plan the words. They simply arrived the way true things sometimes do, flat and immediate and entirely without drama. "It's Tuesday." Nobody in that chamber understood the reference, and I did not explain it, because there was nothing to explain that would have made it less true. Where I came from, a history like mine was not an exception you grieved over. It was the baseline you built a life on top of. Tragedy implies an interruption of something ordinary. For my generation, and my father's, and his father's before him, it had never once been an interruption. It had simply been Tuesday, and Wednesday, and every day after that, until enough Tuesdays passed that people forgot to call it anything at all. Torvald did not push further. The counselor called a recess, quieter and longer than the one before it, and this time nobody in the chamber moved right away. They simply sat, 1,000 species worth of representatives, absorbing something that did not fit cleanly into any framework their long peace had ever required them to build. I walked out of that chamber lighter and heavier at the same time, the two feelings occupying the same space without canceling each other out, the way grief and relief sometimes do when they arrive together and refuse to leave separately. Voss caught up to me in the corridor outside, matched my pace without speaking for the first several steps. "You didn't have to give them the ledger," she said eventually. "I didn't give them anything. They pulled it themselves." I kept walking. "Doesn't matter. They were going to find it eventually. Better they hear it from someone who lived next to it than read it as a data file with no voice attached." Voss nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought that was the end of the conversation. Then she said something I have not been able to stop turning over since. "They think they understand us now. They don't. They understand one ledger. There are 3 centuries of ledgers behind that one. Ellis. And every single crew member on this ship is carrying a page of it they've never shown anyone." She stopped walking, looked at me directly. "That's not a criticism. That's a warning. Because there are people in this galaxy who are going to hear what happened in that chamber today and decide we're dangerous, rather than decide we're wounded. And those are not the same thing, but from a distance, they can look identical." I did not know yet how right she was. I would find out soon enough, and it would not come from a friendly voice like Senate Oro's, and it would not come with an inquiry chamber's patience attached to it. It would come from a faction within the compact that had already made up its mind about what we were, long before any of us had finished trying to explain it. They called themselves the Choir. I did not learn that name until after, when there was nothing left to do but learn names and attach them to what had already happened. The inquiry closed without punishment, without a treaty yet, without anything more solid than a mutual agreement to keep talking while both sides tried to figure out what kind of neighbor the other one was going to be. 3 weeks passed. Quiet weeks, careful weeks, the kind where everyone is polite, because nobody has decided yet whether politeness is still required. During those weeks, a slow convoy of colony vessels departed the Marrow's support fleet, carrying the first wave of civilian specialists and their families out toward a system the Compact had offered us as a gesture of goodwill, a modest world on the edge of their territory, unclaimed, livable, quiet. It was meant to be the first human settlement outside our own galaxy, a beginning, not an ending. I was not on that convoy. I have had to live with that fact in a particular way ever since, the way you live with any distance that turns out, later, to have been a mercy you did not ask for and cannot fully accept. The Choir believed, and had believed for longer than anyone in the Compact realized, that certain species should never be allowed to integrate. Their doctrine held that true peace required purity of temperament, that a species raised on war carried war in its blood, the way a scar carries the shape of the wound beneath it, permanently, regardless of how much time passed on top. They had watched the inquiry, they had heard the ledger, they had heard the phrase "it's Tuesday," and where the rest of the chamber had heard grief, They had heard confirmation of everything they already believed. They decided to prove it. I do not have a clean account of what happened to the colony convoy, because I was not there, and because the people who could have told me a clean account did not survive to do so. What I have instead are fragments, pulled together over the following days from black box telemetry, from the last transmissions of 2 escort vessels, from a single garbled message that made it out before the convoy's communications went silent for good. A distress call, 7 words long, cut off before an 8th could follow. Unmarked vessels closing, not compact registry. Then nothing. For 11 hours, while the Marrow and every Allied ship in range burned every ounce of fuel they had trying to close the distance. We arrived too late to save anyone. I want to say that plainly, and only once, because I do not intend to describe what we found when we got there, and I do not think you need me to. Some things do not need description to be understood. You only need to know that a convoy carrying families went out to build something new, and did not arrive, and that the silence afterward was the worst sound I have ever heard, because it had no coffee stain to distract me from it, no small object to fixate on that could carry the weight instead of me. I remember standing on the bridge, staring at a tactical display with nothing left on it to track, and thinking about nothing at all. That is the part nobody tells you about grief large enough. It does not arrive as thought. It arrives as absence, a hole where thought should be, and you stand very still inside that hole until something forces you to move again. What forced the Marrow to move again was Voss's voice, quiet, steady, terrible in its steadiness. Ellis, trace the registry on those unmarked vessels. I want to know exactly who did this, and I want to know before the Compact's own investigators finish their report, because I do not trust that their answer, and our answer, are going to be the same thing. They were not the same thing. The Compact's official inquiry, slow and careful and bound by 11,000 years of due process, was still weeks away from a conclusion. Our own systems, built by a species that had learned the hard way never to wait for due process when a hole like that one was still warm, found the choir's fingerprints within 2 days. I am not going to walk you through what happened after that, not in detail, because detail is not the point of this part of the story, and because some silences deserve to stay silences. What I will tell you is the shape of it, the way you can describe the outline of a thing without describing what is inside. The Marrow, along with 3 Allied vessels who had lost their own people on that convoy, located the choir's home system 12 days later. I was not on the bridge for the engagement itself. Voss ordered me to communications relay, monitoring frequencies, cataloging traffic, keeping a record for the inquiry that would inevitably follow. I think she did that on purpose. I think she understood, better than I did at the time, that there are things a person should be present for, and things a person should be spared, and she made that decision for me before I could make a worse one for myself. What I have from that day is not memory, it is transcript. Cold, factual, time-stamped. 0600. Approach vector confirmed. 0611. Hail sent. No response. 0619. Weapons free. 0702. Engagement concluded. 4 lines. That is the entire record of what happened to a civilization that had, 3 weeks earlier, decided a colony convoy full of families deserved to be a lesson rather than a people. I did not read the casualty figures when they came in. I could have. They were on my console, sitting there in neat rows of data the way all terrible numbers eventually get filed. I looked away from them instead, the same way I had looked at a coffee stain on the day 41 compact ships died, because there is only so much a person can hold directly before they need somewhere smaller to put their eyes. What I held on to instead, in the days that followed, was a single unbroken description filed by our own reconnaissance drones before the engagement began, a routine survey of the choir's home system exactly as it had existed the morning we arrived. Gardens grown in careful spirals along 3 moons. A capital city built from a stone that glowed faintly gold at dusk. Children, their reconnaissance footage noted almost as an afterthought, playing some kind of game involving a floating disc and a great deal of laughter, in a courtyard near what the drones identified as a school. I read that description more times than I should admit. I do not know why I needed it. Maybe because it was the last version of that place that still made sense to me, the version before, the version that existed in the same universe as gardens and laughter and children with floating discs, instead of the version that came after, filed in a single terse line by the same reconnaissance system less than a day later. Structure integrity, negligible. Population signature, negligible. 2 words, negligible, twice. That is what a civilization becomes, in the language of a sensor log, once you have finished proving a point you never should have had to prove. I did not sleep for 3 days after that. When I finally did, I dreamed about the coffee stain instead of anything real, which I have come to understand is simply how my mind protects itself, by handing me something small and stupid, and endlessly cleanable, in place of the thing it cannot bear to show me directly. Senate Oro visited the Marrow 8 days later, alone, without an entourage, without the careful diplomatic language it had used in every prior meeting. It found me in the observation lounge, staring out at a star field I was not actually seeing, and it sat down across from me without asking permission, which was new, because up until that moment, it had always asked. "I want to understand something," it said, "and I do not think I am going to like the answer, but I would rather have it than not. Ask. Did your people retaliate because you believed it would prevent this from happening again? Or did you retaliate because the loss demanded a response, regardless of what it prevented?" I thought about that longer than the question probably deserved, because I owed Senate Oro an honest answer, and honest answers about a thing like that do not arrive quickly. "Both," I said finally. "And I don't think we know how to separate those 2 reasons anymore. Maybe we never did. Maybe that's the whole problem." I looked at it directly, 4 eyes and all, and for the first time since we had met, I did not feel the reflex to flinch from the contact. "You asked me once what my species wants. I gave you the honest answer that day. We want to go home. We're just bad at it. I think I owe you the second half of that answer now. The part I didn't say out loud because I didn't fully understand it myself yet. Go on. We're not dangerous because we enjoy being dangerous. We're dangerous because every time something threatens what little we have left, some old part of us decides that being gentle again can wait until after we've made sure there's a later to be gentle in. I don't know how to turn that off. I'm not sure anyone in 3 centuries has figured out how." I looked back out at the stars. "I think that's why the choir was wrong about us, and also, somehow, why they weren't wrong at all. We're not what they said we were, but we became, for one very bad morning, exactly what they were afraid of. And I don't have a clean answer for how those 2 things can both be true." Senate Oro did not respond right away. It simply sat with me, in a silence that was not the frightened kind, and not the accusing kind, but something closer to shared, 2 beings from opposite ends of a galaxy gap, sitting together in the wreckage of a lesson neither of them had wanted taught. "I do not think you are what the choir believed," it said eventually. "But I understand now why so many in the compact will find that difficult to remember, going forward. Fear is not always about what a thing intends. Sometimes it is only about what a thing has proven itself capable of, once, under the wrong circumstances." "Yeah," I said. "That's about the shape of it." We sat together a while longer, not speaking, and I remember thinking, somewhere in that silence, that this was probably the moment the galaxy quietly decided what kind of species had just arrived among them. Not the arrival itself, not the drill, and not the inquiry, and not even the ledger. This. A morning full of gardens and children with a floating disc, turned into 2 words in a sensor log, and a species on both sides of that report trying to figure out how to keep living with what had been proven true about themselves. The treaty took 4 months to write and 11 minutes to sign. That imbalance says more about the compact than any single clause inside the document itself. I was present for the signing, standing behind Voss the way I had stood behind her at every major moment since we crossed into this galaxy, and I remember thinking, watching Torvald Nayeri press its seal beside her signature, that the room felt nothing like the chamber where the inquiry had taken place. That room had been full of questions. This one was full of something quieter and harder to name, a kind of exhausted respect that neither side entirely trusted yet, but both sides had decided to try anyway. The treaty itself read like every other peace the compact had ever brokered across 11,000 years of careful diplomacy. Territorial boundaries, drawn generously in our favor given how little of the galaxy we actually occupied. Trade corridors, opened for resources neither species had realized the other needed. An exchange program for scholars and specialists, The kind of thing that sounds hopeful on paper and takes a decade to actually produce its first graduate. Standard language. Careful language. The language of a civilization that had done this so many times before that it could draft the shape of peace almost without thinking. Almost. Buried in the annex, 3 pages from the end, in a clause that took the negotiating teams 6 full weeks to argue into its final form, was a single provision that did not resemble anything else in the document. Torvald Nieri had fought for it personally, over the objections of nearly a third of the Compact's ruling council, and I did not understand until much later just how much political capital that fight had cost. Sol system vessels retain unilateral right of response. No committee review required. No formal request for Compact authorization. No mandatory waiting period. No inquiry convened before action could be taken. If a Sol system vessel determined it or its people faced genuine threat, it could act, immediately, on its own judgment, and the rest of the Compact agreed, in writing, not to treat that action as a violation requiring sanction. I asked Torvald about it privately, after the signing, while the rest of the room was still full of careful applause and careful smiles, and the particular kind of relief that comes from surviving a negotiation rather than winning one. Why did you fight for this? I asked. Every other species in the Compact operates under collective review. Why give us something different? Torvald considered the question with the same unhurried patience it had shown throughout the entire inquiry, all those months ago, and then answered with honesty I had not expected. Because we tested the alternative already, Officer Cole, and we did not survive the test well. We asked your captain to wait 6 minutes during that drill, the way every other species we have ever contacted has been willing to wait. 41 crews did not survive those 6 minutes existing at all. We asked nothing of the choir, and a colony convoy did not survive that either. A pause. Longer this time. Something almost like weariness moving behind its 4 eyes. We did not grant you this clause because we respect what you did with the freedom to act on your own judgment. We granted it because we have now seen, twice, what happens when we do not, and we have decided we would rather live with the version of your species that acts quickly and is occasionally wrong, than the version of your species that waits politely and is occasionally extinct. I did not have a response to that. I am still not sure I have one now. Within the year, I heard later, through channels far above my clearance, that at least a dozen other Compact member species had quietly begun drafting similar provisions into their own defense doctrines, not because they had suddenly grown fond of unilateral action, but because they had watched what happened to a species that reserved the right to protect itself without asking permission first, and they had decided, in their own long, careful, 11,000-year-old way, that perhaps permission was a luxury not every crisis could afford to wait for. We did not become beloved because of that treaty. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters more than the parts of this story that make us sound impressive. We became respected in the specific, careful way you respect something you have learned not to underestimate. Compact vessels that once approached human ships with easy warmth, now approached with warmth still present, but layered now with a kind of attentiveness that had not existed before. Senate Oro still visited, still sat with me in the observation lounge some evenings, still asked questions with the same open curiosity it always had. But it never touched my shoulder again without asking first. I noticed that. I do not think it was unkind of it to stop. I think it was the opposite. I think it was the most generous thing anyone in the Compact ever did for us, quietly adjusting a habit of 11,000 years, because it had learned, the hard way, what that habit could cost a species raised the way we were raised. That is the part of this story I keep coming back to, more than the drill, more than the ledger, more than the fragments of a colony convoy, or the 2 terse words filed about a system full of gardens. Not the violence, the adjustment. 1,000 species, ancient and gentle and utterly unprepared for us, looking at what we were capable of, and choosing, deliberately, to make room for it, rather than reject it outright. That took more courage from them, I think, than it took from us, to arrive in the first place. I am writing this account down, finally, a year after the treaty, because Voss asked me to. She said someone should keep an honest record, not the polished version that ends up in official archives, not the frightened version that circulates as rumor among species who only ever hear the word Sol system and picture wreckage. Just the true version, the one with the coffee stain still in it, The one where a man's hand finds a weapon before his brain catches up. The one where a species that only ever wanted to go home discovers it has forgotten, somewhere along the way, how to arrive anywhere without frightening the people already there. I am sitting in the observation lounge as I finish this. It is late, ship time, the kind of late where the corridors go quiet and the stars outside look close enough to touch, though of course they are not. Though of course nothing out here is ever quite as close as it looks. There is a stain on my old console, back on the bridge, that nobody has ever managed to fully clean. I checked, before I sat down to write this. It is still there, small and brown and stubborn, worked into the seam between two keys where it has apparently decided to stay for good. It is the only mess on this entire ship that nobody has ever tried very hard to fix. I think about that sometimes. About all the other things on this ship, and on this crew, and in this whole strange arrangement between our two galaxies, that everyone has worked so hard to smooth over, to explain, to make presentable enough for a peace treaty, and a careful clause in an annex nobody outside the Compact Council will ever read in full. And then I think about that one small, stubborn stain, sitting there in plain sight, unfixed, unexplained, exactly as it has always been. We did not come here to be feared. We just forgot how to be anything else.